All right, we're working on wet technique. I have painted this square here so that I'm able to have it wet with just plain water. And now I'm going to take some pigment and I'm going to apply it to the paper. Watch how it's spreading, but also notice that it's only spreading into the areas where it's wet. What's important with wet on wet technique is if you have areas that you don't want that water to bleed into, that you make sure that you keep that dry. Now, sometimes our papers tend to curl a bit when we use watercolor, especially if you're using regular drawing paper. So it's important to know the difference of what's really going to work for you. So watercolor paper, when you're doing an actual watercolor painting, I will always give you watercolor paper. When you're working with practice, you might not see that beautiful spread as much as you saw in my example, but I definitely will, be able to help you understand. When you have drawing paper, you absolutely can still do these techniques. They're just not as pronounced as perhaps you were expecting, or as you can see in my demonstration. So again, I'm just applying some color in different areas. And each time I touch the paper, it spreads and also mixes with the other colors. All right, so within that area, I have a lot of edges there that still are white and maybe that I wanted to have a little bit more color to. So I'm gonna go in with a little extra paint, and I'm resting my arm on the table because that's gonna help me to control my paintbrush, because I don't want to accidentally go outside of that area. But what I'm trying to get you guys to understand is that I want you to be able to control your paint within the section that you're working on, so that when you do get to your paintings that you're doing, that you understand how to make it look the way you want it to. And often it all comes down to controlling your paint. So I can keep my paint directly in that square that I'm working with. And all I'm doing is, number one, I am controlling the amount of water, and I'm also controlling, if I am working in a small section, I'm ever so lightly touching the paper. Now I have one little spot right over here in the corner where you can see the water has bled from that piece. It has bled over the edge of my paper, or the square that I had. So I'm going to show you how you can fix that. It's a specific technique that I want you guys to learn. All right, so now I've created a nice little colorful square, and the main purpose was to make sure that you could keep your paint in that square. If your paint didn't stay in your square or your circle or your section, that's okay, but ultimately I want you to understand, what do I need to do to prevent that from happening, or how do I fix it? I just made a little paper towel and dipped it in my water, and I'm gonna press it against that area, and I lifted it off. Did you see it? I'm gonna do it again. So I have this tiny little section here. Here's what was there before. The color is still there lightly, but it's not as pronounced. And what I'm doing is I'm gonna take my paper towel and I twisted it into a point, dip it into my water dish, and I'm gonna apply it to just that area. Be really mindful. I am not rubbing my paper. If you rub your paper, it's gonna start to kind of come apart. It starts to disparage or kind of break apart a bit. You'll start to see little paper crumbles, and that's not good at all for watercolor. So we don't do a lot of erasing on watercolor paper. If you're ever doing a pre-drawing with pencil and you're like, oh man, I really messed that up, and you go to do a bunch of erasing, you will definitely be pulling the fibers of the paper off, and that's not good for watercolor application. So what I wanted you guys to know is that if you take just a little bit of a wet paper towel and you press it onto your paper where you have made a mistake, you should be able to lift off the color, or at least the majority of that. All right, so that is wet on wet technique. And since we're working on wet, I would like to be able to create a bit of a painting, so to speak, or more of a scene. So what I think I'm gonna work with is this little image right here where we have a sun and you have lots of different colors. How do I control the paint so that I can do what I wanna do? One thing to keep in mind, I always start light. So in this painting right here, I can see, or the painting below it, I can see areas where I have white paper that is showing through. That happens a lot in painting. So when you have white paper showing through, specifically when you're doing watercolor paint or wet on wet technique, you can't get that paper wet. So what I'm gonna do is I'm making sure I have a clean brush. I've rinsed it in my water, and now I'm gonna apply the water to the paper in only the areas where I want that paint to spread. Now you can't see really what I'm doing from the video standpoint, but ultimately I'm just adding water and I guess you could say some little lines. And then I'm spreading it across. And now I'm gonna start with my yellow paint. If you notice when you get to your yellow paint, sometimes other students have used it and they've mixed colors in there. What I do is I paint over that little spot in my palette until it gets clean. So this was green and now it's looking yellow, all right? All right, now I have just straight yellow and I'm just gonna touch the paper. Just see how it spread? Just gonna touch the paper and watch how it spreads across. Now I'd like to add a little bit of orange, similar to a sunset, and I'm just gonna add that to the sides here. And now I'm gonna go ahead and mix up some of my red and a little bit of purple. And each time I touch that watercolor or the water, it spreads that paint. Okay, I have this tiny little dot down in the bottom, and I don't really like how that looks. It kind of looks like a mistake. This is where I'm gonna go in and I'm gonna fix little areas that look like mistakes. Now, I'm just starting to add a little bit of blue around the areas. I'm actually applying that to some of the dry areas. What happens when you mix all of your colors together? It's gonna turn brown. So when your colors start mixing on the paper and you're not really liking what's happening, which often happens when it comes to watercolor paint. So watch what I'm gonna do. If I don't like what's happening in the colors that I've just mixed, I'm going to take a dry paper towel. So take a look up here so you guys can see. I have a lot of water added to this, and I decided I really don't like what I'm seeing. I'm going to do a lift. So what that is, I'm just taking my paper towel. I am not rubbing it, and I'm applying it to the surface. And then I still have the ability to work with that. I just need to let that paper dry. Now, if there's some that's just not coming up, I'm going to take my paintbrush and I'm going to apply some water to that area. If you let watercolor dry, it's usually going to be permanent unless you have washable watercolor paints. We're using permanent watercolor paint, so once they dry on your paper, they're going to stay there. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to let that be there to dry, and I'm going to go ahead and redo what I wanted to do, which is a nice little painted scene showing wet on wet technique, but that looks more like a sunset, I suppose. So I'm going to paint the paper just wet, straight water, being mindful to stay at the edges of my square. If you're real careful with the edges, then you can be a little less careful when you're painting the inside. All right, now I'm going to go in with my yellow, and I'm going to touch the page. And now I'm just applying some water. And right in the center of that yellow, I'm going to do another lift. I'm going to make what looks like the sun. So I'm going to apply a little more water right in here, in the center of the yellow. And watch, I'm going to take my paper towel and I'm going to do a lift. See that nice white area I created? Now if this area is getting a little too wet, just apply your paper towel, and that's going to help lift off any extra watercolor that starts to puddle. So now I'm going to let that dry just a little bit, because if I want to add the blue like they've done in this picture here, I really don't want that to bleed too much. So I'm going to let it dry because it is puddling a little bit around here. And I'm going to spread that around just a little bit. And then I'm going to come back with some blue in just a minute.